So, welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Suki Wessling, and today's show features current and former researchers at UCSC whose work explores the future of technology. Although my guests have done wide-ranging work in the field, today's discussion will center on the question of bias in emerging technology. In the second part of the program, we'll speak with UCSC Associate Professor of Literature Zac Zimmer, who researches cultural misrepresentations in AI technosystems. But first, we're going to delve into the hopes and fears represented in speculative fiction. My two guests in the studio worked together at Meta's Reality Labs on a fascinating project using fiction to explore people's relationship with emerging technologies. Theresa Hice-Fromille is a PhD candidate in sociology with designated emphases in critical race and ethnic studies and feminist studies. Theresa's doctoral research is in solidarity with community organizations that take Black youth abroad and focuses on the legacies of decolonial education in Black radical organizations and diasporic travel. Theresa is an incoming assistant professor of geography at Ohio State University in fall 2022. Welcome, Theresa, and congratulations on the new job.
Thank you.
And Sarah Papazoglakis is a strategist and subject matter expert in privacy ethics and consumer trust. Prior to joining Reality Labs at Meta, she served as an ethics and privacy advisor for Google and DeepMind and developed the digital privacy policy for the city of San Jose. She holds a PhD in literature with a designated emphasis in critical race and ethnic studies from UC Santa Cruz. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
The first thing I'd love to know is, what is it that you did? Because when people think about the future of technology in the real world, they don't always think about fiction. So why use fiction? What did you do with the fiction, etc.? Theresa, you want to start?
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to say that, even though that might be true, that that's not necessarily what we think of first, so many devices or tools, pieces of technology are actually inspired by popular literature.
Yeah. The tricorder.
Yeah.
For example.
So many things.
The flip phone.
Now and things that don't seem like the helicopter, which I learned today from Sarah. But we were interested in drawing on a different archive of literature for inspiration for emerging technologies and understanding what technologies could be and their uses could be from different perspectives. So the literatures that we were looking at and these texts range from not just novels, but also comic books, movies, music, lots of different kinds of texts, were mainly from Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurism, Asian futurism, Latinx futurism, with then a small portion of what we considered mainstream media, which was kind of, not centered in a particular ethnicity.
Mm-hmm. And so describe, is this a range of work from authors we might have heard of, generally in popular culture, to people who are writing in niche areas, or where did you get the works that you looked at?
Sure. So large, big texts, well-known texts like Black Panther, Wakanda Forever are on our list, as well as some popular comic book artists. Bitterroot, Sanford Green is big in the comic book world, as well as some comic books by Victor Laval, who is also well known for his horror, using kind of the style of horror that he writes, but then also a lot of indigenous comic artists who aren't, I don't think, as well known, and the collection of anthologies that we used that they're housed in. But then also music that's well known. Janelle Monáe is really well known as an Afrofuturist artist, and
Octavia Butler.
Yeah, Octavia Butler is I think, really well known right now.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I will just interject that that all of Talk of the Bay shows are podcasted through all the various podcasting platforms. So you're listening right now. You probably don't need that. But we also put information about each show on the website, ksqd.org. And I already have a page in progress that will get this recording and go live with links to some of this information. So if you are interested in learning about technologies that were first thought of in fiction, for example, you can go there for sure. Yeah. So what, when you start with fiction, what are you looking for, and especially fiction by marginalized people in marginalized communities? What are you looking for that you wouldn't find in some researcher who's the great thinker about where technology is going to go next? Because these people are not technologists, the writers.
Right, definitely. So we're just thinking about imagination in general, but also engagement with different tools, and for the reasons of why you would engage with tools and how you would navigate tools that aren't necessarily designed with you in mind, or how you might have designed them or navigate them from your particular, standpoint, your position in life. So it's offering a different perspective, which can be really helpful, especially for thinking about the people who aren't in the room when these tools are being made. So we're able to look at these texts and see what kind of tools, what the tools or specific technologies are being engaged that people are really excited about, or that are really concerned about. And if they're concerned about them, how are they planning to engage them or engaging them in the moment? How are they planning survival mechanisms to engage with them, knowing that they do exist in the world?
And I guess the question is, when you did this, well, people can read more about the connection between UCSC and Meta Labs, but how did you approach this as a project? How did it come to be?
Mm-hmm. I guess that would be for me. This is Sarah. The first idea came about when companies last year started talking about the metaverse and how we're going to build the metaverse. And immediately, a lot of fiction was being called to mind. Ready Player One, Snow Crash. There's kind of like a litany of the kind of same old texts that are continually cited that are really restrictive in terms of the types of demographics they're representing and the authorial imagination being presented there. So, one of the nice things about working at Meta is they have this saying of bring your whole self to work. And while I'm a trust strategist in my day-to-day role, my background with my PhD in literature and critical race and ethnic studies opened the opportunity for me to host a fellowship in which we were looking to understand more about how we can shape the metaverse for everyone, and use literature beyond the kind of same old cited text. Especially, a lot of my work was on Black, Latino, and Central American literature. So thinking about some of those texts and how they were thinking about technology got me thinking that it would be an cool opportunity to bring someone like Theresa in to really dig deeper into building out not only a reading list, but then looking at those texts about what recommendations we can pull from those texts for building more inclusive, accessible technology that's working for everyone. And so that's kind of the origin.
Well, can you give us some examples of things that you saw, specific examples of some things that you saw so that listeners can get a sense of what is it? Well, we'll get to your recommendations, but first, what did you use? What did you see, for example, a hope or a fear that you saw often, and what was it?
Sure. So a big fear, right, is the asymmetries in power. That was one that was one of the first ones that we were able to identify, and that we talked about consistently throughout the project. And so this is really the understanding that it's the difference between the people who are using the technologies and the people who are developing them, and what is embedded within the technology that people who are using them are really concerned about. And so we can think about surveillance technologies, we could think about data collections and things like that people are concerned that they don't have really any control over. They don't really know how it works, and that it can potentially be used against them. And so we broke that down into a couple different things, not just power, but also surveillance, and really thinking about what is it exactly that people are concerned about, and what are in their articulation of being concerned about that. What are they saying that they really want to have instead of that? Instead of that difference in power, that level of power, how would they rather the power be shared? And how would they like companies to be able to demonstrate to users that they are willing to share that power with their users?
And so, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to add that I think Black Panther was one of the big inspirations for both of us as well. In the first Black Panther movie, you have King T'Challa coming into power, and one way to read that story is a story about privacy and control over information. And one of the big challenges and sources of drama in the movie is about how much information about Wakanda the community wants to share. And then it's pretty amazing that Wakanda Forever then picks up that theme and looks at the consequences, even when Wakandans themselves decided to share information in a particular way, the ramifications of that and how they continue to deal with that. And so as a central theme, those are the ways, one example of the ways we're reading text for those themes and pulling out specific then recommendations for product design to ensure that the control over information, the sharing of information is done in a way that protects communities, that serves the communities, and that is doing good, quote unquote, more good than harm.
And can you give one example of something from the past, a concern that was expressed in speculative fiction of some sort that did come to pass, so that people can get a sense of what sort of thinking people did in the past?
So just to clarify, is it a text that was...
Yeah, so for example, did a writer foresee something like racial profiling done through machine identification of people or anything like that?
Sure. So you want to give the example of Octavia Butler?
Yeah, do you want to take it?
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the examples we were actually talking about before the show is just how Octavia Butler's Parable series has become such a cultural touchstone within our recent political atmosphere and the conditions of climate change. And a lot of what she talks about with technology is so far in the future that maybe that remains to be seen, but she has very well predicted some of the consequences of climate change, the way that people have had to, climate migrants move away from places because of fire, because of flooding, because of the kind of extreme weather that we've actually seen around here recently. And so one of the things that she thinks about is she compares, virtual reality headsets, which is something I work on, for example, which she calls dream masks in the Parable of the Talent series, and thinks about them as a comparison to previous technologies like slave collars and how they can be used, and its application and use is really something that can change the whole character of the technology when it's used to intentionally oppress people, hold them in bondage. And so I'm not sure that that's an example of the technology itself coming to bear yet, but it's something for us to really think about, the ways in which such an immersive technology, something that is, you're putting on your face, you're immersing yourself in, can potentially become this kind of grip in reality that has a really negative consequence.
I have to say that any parent of a teenager listening right now is going to disagree with you that this has not come to pass.
Well, sure.
I would just add that we we looked at the term technology very specifically too, right? So we draw from Ruha Benjamin, who talks about race as a technology, that it's a tool used specifically for the oppression of certain groups of people. And so with that, that really defines on how we look at these texts and parse out what are the technologies being used. So when we think about that, we look at history differently as well. And that also is how a lot of writers, and especially Indigenous writers, are engaging with stories from the past in their speculative writings. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we can think about smallpox blankets, right? Blankets as a technology used for the oppression and genocide of Indigenous people. We can think of treaties as a technology that was, made with the quote-unquote intention to protect Indigenous lands and people and rights, and then have been trampled upon and haven't worked the way that they were supposed to. So we also look at the way that these the intentions behind the technologies and how they've come to pass in reality, to also inform how they could come to pass in other ways too.
And so finally, you also developed a list of recommendations is this for industry to consider when they're designing new technologies?
It's for industry, but we also are really adamant that, everybody needs to participate in this, that it's not, that we can't parse out the difference, but we can't make industry totally responsible for these technologies, that users have to play a role in what they demand from the tech companies, that legal has to play a role, politics and the law have to catch up and demand that tech follows the rules. And so, but the most of the guidelines are directed specifically toward tech, since we were working within Reality Labs and really wanted to get a set of guidelines to them to really help shape what they were working on.
Mm-hmm. And so, can you just briefly outline what the recommendations are?
Yeah, so there's 25 according to 10 different themes. So, for example, under the idea of sharing power, we have data sharing. So, thinking alongside with the data health and equity policies that Apple has participated in, recommending that all tech companies are engaging in those and also expanding them. And these make the data that the companies are collecting public, so that everyone can access them, so that they can be used by any researcher, any public researcher, and everybody knows what data is being collected. We also have recommendations for things like surveillance, understanding that the people who are the most, who are surveilled the most, are participating in the development of these programs, and also in the ways that tech companies are trying to facilitate some sort of surveillance on the program. So we understand that there needs to be systems of protection, especially as they're engaged by people of different ages and across different countries, but ensuring that people are participating to make sure that those systems of engagement are not feeling oppressive in any way.
And can I add just one more, a big one that I think Theresa's implying even by speaking of it, because it was so fundamental to the project, is co-creation. And one of the themes that emerges continually out of every single text we were looking at is the importance of agency and ensuring that people are given the opportunity to participate in that co-creation of technology, that it's not so asymmetrical, that, as Theresa said, not just what users demand of the technology, but how they're participating in the creation of it itself, is just a recurrent part of ensuring that balance of power, that accountability is there, and that lack of asymmetry.
Well, I want to thank you both. It's amazing how quickly 20 minutes goes. We're going to return in just a minute to Talk of the Bay with Zac Zimmer to talk about his research into AI. And we'll have a short break. Thank you, Theresa Hice-Fromille and Sarah Papazoglakis. And I really appreciate hearing from you both. That was great. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Now we're going to move to a whole different point of view, and I'd like to welcome UCSC Associate Professor of Literature, Zac Zimmer, who researches cultural misrepresentations in AI technosystems. His research focuses on the interdisciplinary study of literature, culture, and technology in the hemispheric Americas. His book, First Contact: Speculative Visions of the Conquest of the Americas, is forthcoming. And welcome, Zac.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
And there you are with the magic of technology.
Mm-hmm.
When technology is being kind to me, I love technology on the radio.
Mm-hmm. And that was such a great segment. I really enjoyed listening to Theresa and Sarah.
Yeah, and we, they brought up all sorts of things that I think that our conversation will loop back into. But I wanted to start because we were talking about starting with the the thing that everybody's talking about right now, which is ChatGPT and these AI tools that are called large language models. And I wanted to start by laying some groundwork there because I know that a lot of people are interested in these, they're concerned about them, they're excited about them, but I think that not a lot of us really understand the background. So starting from, I guess we're starting from mid 20th century. Can you start us in by talking a little bit about the Turing Test?
Oh, yes, I would love to. And I just want to say at the outset that I really love studying these new technologies, and I like to think about them from a historical perspective. So for me, the question of the Turing Test and these earlier chatbots like Eliza that I'll talk about in a second, it's so important for understanding where we are right now. And I want to understand how to change our relationships with these systems and our relationships among ourselves and with the world. So I think it's a really exciting moment right now. But in this conversation, I am going to be a little bit critical of some of these generative AI systems and these large language models, or LLMs. In part because I think they're pulling a lot from what had happened in the 20th century and kind of reproducing a lot of the same either dead ends or errors that we got into. Mm-hmm. There was a very famous chatbot that was designed in the mid-20th century called Eliza. It was very simple design. It was not a convoluted neural net. It was not generative in the way that GPT technology is. It was just a simple therapist bot that was developed basically to keep you talking. Mm-hmm. You'd type something in and it would respond saying, well, how does that make you feel? And things like this.
Yes, and I will add that when I was an undergrad, we used to like to sit at the terminal of the mainframe computer and make Eliza say all sorts of ridiculously silly things.
Of course, and because it's so enticing. And I think that's one of the really important things to recognize. And that's actually something I think that has been misrepresented in the history of Eliza. It was understood in a very gendered way. The person who developed it brought his secretary in to start playing around with it. And his secretary, this is a famous anecdote that has been told and retold many times, after interacting with Eliza, this therapist chatbot, for a couple minutes, turned around to the person who designed it, Jacob Wiseman, I think is his name, and said, "Will you please leave us alone for a few minutes?" And, that's always been represented as like, oh, this silly secretary woman thought that the bot was real and wanted to get into it with it. But, I don't really think that's what was happening. I think that she was really excited to play with it and experiment with it without believing that it was a real human being or some kind of autonomous general intelligence on the other end of it, but just wanted to take advantage of engaging with it about things that she didn't want her boss to know. So I think one thing that we can learn from that particular lesson is that we are interested in experimenting and playing around with these chatbots, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to attribute human agency to them. We don't have to be fooled by them to enjoy experimenting with them. And I think that's just a really important thing that I want to say at the outset, because I do think that a lot of the marketing and hype around these new chatbots is actually very focused on their capacity to fool us, to make us think that they're human. And I really think that all comes out of the legacy of the Turing Test, which perhaps I should just explain a little bit what that is.
Sure.
That's not something that you talk about every day on this show.
No, I know all about it, but I'm married to a computer scientist. So,
So the essentially it's one of, so Alan Turing was a cryptographer. He's famously portrayed in this film called The Imitation Game that was about him cracking the German Nazi Enigma code. And but the Imitation Game was also a name for what he called the Turing Test, which was a philosophical thought experiment that he developed after World War II in his early research on artificial intelligence. And the whole point of the Turing Test, it's basically just a thought experiment to say that if we disembody these chatbots and if we just interface with them through a text terminal and we're typing and have a conversation through a computer screen and a keyboard, and that chatbot can fool us into thinking that we're conversing with an actual human being, or if we can't tell the difference between a chatbot and a human being, that program will have passed the Turing Test, meaning that it has some level of artificial intelligence. It was a very early benchmark for setting and measuring these kinds of things. So, the question he was trying to get at was, can a machine think? Which is a very novel question in the 1950s, when any thinking a machine would be doing would be done through punch cards on mainframe computers that are the size of industrial freezers that you'd find in a restaurant. These were not the portable little devices with all the amazing microcircuitry and technology that we have today. So if the participant in this conversation can't tell from the written response of the chatbot whether that chatbot is a person or a computer, then it passes the Turing Test. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's actually framed our entire understanding of artificial intelligence. And let me say this, your husband will probably back this up, that within the fields of artificial intelligence, the Turing Test is not really looked at as an important benchmark. And in fact, there was a competition for most of the, in the 90s and in the 2000s, that tried to have the best Turing Test style chatbot to award a prize, but that prize was never looked at as any kind of meaningful advance in research on artificial intelligence. But where it is very much alive is in the popular consciousness of what these artificial technosystems are. And I think it's really been re-engaged now by the marketing hype and the PR hype coming out of Silicon Valley and these companies about these chatbots, which are not, they're nowhere close to artificial general intelligence. They're not, they're just not. But what they are they're very good at tricking us into thinking that they're humans. So I think it's, go ahead.
So I was just going to say that's it's a sort of interesting question. What is the purpose of a tool? Because this is a tool. It's not a thinking being. It's a tool. And if the purpose is just to fool us, is that useful?
Yes, very much so. Because if we take this benchmark that it needs to fool us in order to convince us that it is truly intelligent. I mean, we're already on the course of this morass that we're in right now, where many of my colleagues at UCSC campus and at universities and colleges and high schools across the country and the world, people are very, very worried precisely because these tools can be used to fool educators, professors, and pedagogues into thinking that the material that we're reading has been produced by students. But I guess what I'm saying is that the tools, these chatbots, they were never designed to give us accurate or correct information right now, especially the ChatGPT that was launched several months ago. It was specifically in the legacy of this Turing Test idea to engage us in a way that we would be fooled into thinking that we were interacting with a human being. And I think that line of research has really gotten us into this position we are right now, where we are right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not just those, but, if you go to arguably stupider tools like Siri, Alexa, and the phrase "I am not going to say" because my phone is right here. You do interact with it. You say "hey" to it, and it uses the pronoun "I." What's the problem with this?
Well, so it's a very interesting question. I think to get to the problem, we have to talk a little bit along the lines of what Theresa and Sarah were talking about, who are in the room when these tools are being designed, and if we're going to counter that problem, how can we use the imagination to imagine other folks in other rooms designing other tools? But so I think that's how we deal with this problem going forward. But I do want to say that it is, there are benefits to these chatbots. I see, I look at them as kind of like a diagnostic tool to remind us all in the university space and educational spaces why we're together, what has brought us together to learn and to study. And so we can use these tools to collaborate in producing educated subjects, let's say. But I think it's a really open question right now, whether at the institutional level, if universities, if schools, if colleges really want to produce students who know how to read and to write and to think. And so I think it really does pose these existential questions to us, if we want to produce students who can do these things, or rather if we want to produce systems to automate these kinds of processes in the service of some other kind of silent pedagogical goal that's not being articulated. So,
well, that would be the question. What is that silent pedagogical goal if it's not to educate people to be able to to use their own intellect with whatever materials they have in hand, whether it be ChatGPT or a paper encyclopedia, to draw conclusions and make decisions based on those conclusions.
Yes, indeed. And I think we can take that educational or pedagogical problem and expand it more broadly to another issue that I think is unresolved and being contested right now in our shared social world, about whether any of these predictive systems that we're developing should be directed to perpetuate the status quo in its inequality and injustice, or whether it's to change and improve those situations. And that fundamentally and ultimately gets to the question of power and who's in the room and what the imaginaries of the people designing these technologies are basically. And so, I think that while those fundamental issues remained unresolved in a space of contestation, both in technology and society, I do think that some of these companies that are shipping these large language model systems have already given us a de facto answer in favor of strengthening and perpetuating the status quo.
Yeah, and I mean, I find it very interesting that, we know that ChatGPT specifically, and I haven't looked at the others, but they're similar. the ones that are out or forthcoming, they're using all of the stuff that's out there that they have access to be trained. And we know what a vile cesspool that of of hatred, intolerance, and lies you can find on the internet. So, so what I would love to do is, in a minute, when we return to the show, we can talk about who is in the room, what you know of their intentions and their concerns, and move on to what can be done. So we will be right back with more Talk of the Bay. Now back to Talk of the Bay. We're here. I'm speaking with Zac Zimmer, who is a researcher at UCSC. And in the first part of the program, I spoke to two other researchers who researched speculative fiction and the concerns that it raised about future technologies. And now Zac and I are talking about things like ChatGPT, these large language models that have made such a splash in the press. And, we're going to go now to talking about who's in the room, who is behind these, and what their intention is, what they are doing with them. And then also, I hope to get to some positives at the end about technology, because technology is, as Zac and I discussed earlier, really great too. So Zac, welcome back.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So who is in the room, and what are they doing, and what do you see happening?
So that's such a great and important question, and I'm so glad that it's been framed already by bringing up the importance of the imagination in these spaces with the first segment. I'm going to talk about a paper that was published 2 years ago. It has a rather funny title. Some of you listeners might know it. Others might be absolutely mystified, so I'll explain what the title is. But it's the Stochastic Parrots paper, called On Stochastic Parrots and the Danger of Large Language Models. And I think that if I mentioned earlier when we were talking that the Turing Test is an important metaphor to keep in mind when we're thinking about how these large language models and these generative pre-trained transformers, or GPTs, are working, I think the stochastic parrot is also a very important metaphor to keep in our mind. We obviously understand what a parrot is, and that the parrot is famous for repeating and imitating human language. That's one of the reasons why we like to have them around. And so if the parrot is a symbol of, say, pure repetition and imitation of human language, the kind of human language that is being parroted by these models or these AI technosystems is precisely stochastic. What that means, it's a technical term for a statistically determined process that produces a probable set of unpredictable outcomes. Or in other words, random outputs within a probability distribution. This is why I'm very confident in saying that these large language models are not exhibiting any kind of consciousness or self-consciousness, because they're just statistically predicting the next word, the next pixel in an image. This is why people kind of derisively call them super autocomplete or something like that.
Yeah, we've all played that autocomplete game, right? Where you see what it suggests next, and I think that most people who have done that notice that it gets more and more boring as it goes along. And that
Indeed.
People have also criticized ChatGPT for this sort of going into vague generalities.
And so this paper was published in March of 2021 about the ethical concerns raised by these LLMs and these GPTs. And the reason that I'm bringing it up is because this paper, even though it was released in 2021, right around the time when GPT-3 had been released and was being shown in some demos to people, a group of ethicists, some of whom were working at large tech firms and some of whom were academic or independent researchers, some of them published under pseudonyms because they didn't want their employees figuring out exactly who they were saying these critical perspectives. Not that that did any good, because many of these people got fired in very famous cases that might ring a bell for some of your listeners. But the reason I'm bringing it up is because they raised 4 main ethical concerns back in 2021 when GPT-3 was the state of the art. And none of these concerns have been addressed by any of the main companies developing these new language models. ChatGPT is GPT 3.5, a kind of iteration on GPT-3. And now we have GPT-4, we have Bard, we have integration of GPT into Microsoft. And yet none of these new iterations of the technology ever directly addressed these 4 points. And maybe I should just lay out what they are. Because the 4 main arguments that the ethicists in this Stochastic Parrots paper were talking about. First were the energy and environmental concerns in training the language models and the opportunity cost of what that compute power could have been used for otherwise. That was perhaps the most controversial part of the paper within some of the companies that were developing these, because they were saying they were trying to develop lower compute heavy models that didn't need to use as much energy. We also might be familiar with this issue in discussions of cryptocurrency mining and the very huge cost, environmental cost and energy costs in developing these systems. So even though when we're playing around with these GPT systems at our computer terminal and it seems very effortless and like it's just coming, the training of these systems is incredibly energy intensive. And so they were just raising the point about that, which is one of the ethical areas that needs to be considered. But much more in line with the points that Theresa and Sarah were making, or the second, third, and fourth points. The second being that these, so the P in GPT stands for pre-trained, and they're being trained on massive scrapes of internet data, like either the Common Crawl or ImageNet. These are very famous data sets. The data sets themselves are very problematic, the ones that we know about, and some of the other data sets are proprietary and closed. So even though one of these companies has open in its name, they actually don't release these data sets, so we can't audit them. But as you mentioned before, it is basically just a scrape of all the good and all of the bad that's on the internet that's just being dumped into these systems to train them. The third issue that they brought up is one of the recommendations that Sarah was talking about that came out of their work, the early engagement of stakeholders. But that ship has sailed at this point. Many of the stakeholders were not engaged, much like the communities that are most surveilled by predictive policing algorithms were not consulted before the deployment of these algorithms, right? And so we have to expand our concept of who is actually a stakeholder in these technologies. And then finally, the fourth point that they bring up in this paper are the potential for the risk of dual use of these technologies, that they can be used to spread disinformation, but also harm mitigation of actual existing harms. It's not like we need to speculate out into the future that there are some potential harms that some diabolical AI is going to cause for us, because we know there are actual existing harms that are being caused by these algorithms, by these technical systems. Your previous guest mentioned Ruha Benjamin, who is an incredible scholar whose book, Race After Technology, profoundly documents many of the actual existing harms. So those are the main points that they wanted to bring up. And
so let's, I guess the other points fascinate me deeply, but let's look at two of them. Who's in the room? Who's being affected? We know that Silicon Valley is, in a major way, very unrepresentative of our society. So what, and they might say, well, we scrape data from all sorts of people, but the people building the systems, are not necessarily talking to anyone outside of their own cultural bubble, let's say, in Silicon Valley, what could be done? How could you do that? How could you be engaging with people who might be harmed by this?
Yeah, such an important question. And so we all know the tech acronym GIGO or GIGO, G-I-G-O, garbage in, garbage out. Mm-hmm. And so I do want to break the question into two different points to say that one of the ways of addressing this is the information that goes into the training sets, and the other aspect of this is who is designing the technologies, but they're very much connected. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the training data that has gone into developing these systems, it is us in a certain sense, because it's a common crawl scrape of everything on the internet, or almost everything on the internet. Mm-hmm. But it's not all of us. And it's not all of us in the sense that it represents any one of us in our full totality, in our full humanity. Mm-hmm. But also it doesn't represent what we call underrepresented groups or minoritized populations. That's precisely why we refer to them as underrepresented or minoritized. So it's the solution needs to come from both angles. It needs to have a more curated and representative understanding of the training data that's going into these systems. We can't just be feeding, say, information from a racialized policing system to then predict where crimes are going to be occurring in the future, because it's simply going to perpetuate those existing racialized problems of policing. Yeah. But also to even be able to frame the question in that way, to realize there's a problem, you do need a diversity of representation in the room when the technologies are being designed. So I think those two things go hand in hand. And I don't want to attribute bad intention to any of the people who are designing these technologies. Well, let me say, some of the ways that they're marketing the technologies, I think, is profoundly irresponsible, and it's very much tied in to the hype cycles of hypercapitalism and trying to create either interest or fear or demand for a technology that they don't otherwise know how to sell. Yeah, the reason we know that is because it's being released for free.
Well, yeah, and I know that I was listening to a podcast about ChatGPT and these other large language models, and they were saying that, there's been the requests that these companies take a 6-month breather so that these issues can be talked about, but it doesn't look like that could happen. And who would talk, and who would be the stakeholders in that conversation, and what would happen on the other end of it has not been discussed.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And these, I think that particular letter that you're referring to, asking for the pause, that again, to get to the question of stakeholders, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that letter was signed by a bunch of technologists and software engineers and people generally in that space who are not working at either Microsoft or OpenAI, the companies that have partnered in releasing the newest iteration. So it did kind of seem like that. I would say that the signatories of that letter are not necessarily the people that we're talking about as forming a part of an expanded understanding of the stakeholders in this technology. Yeah. Right. It's a lot of work to bring these people to the table. It involves also, as Sarah and Theresa were mentioning, it involves engaging the imagination as well, and thinking about how these technologies could be used in radically different ways for radically different goals that are not simply predicting the next word that my students are going to write in their essays.
Yeah, yeah. And when you think about that when we think about this as a tool, and what is it a tool for? If it's just a tool to predict And I will tell you that I took the New York Times' quiz on where they had ChatGPT versus real student writing, and I did pretty darn well because I'm an English teacher. And so I sort of noticed, there were certain things that you could see. But we humans aren't prediction machines. In fact, the best papers written by students are ones where the teacher goes, "Oh, I didn't expect that." So, it's problematic just in that sense. But, it's just amazing how quickly an hour goes. I'm going to ask you one more question. We just have a couple minutes left. And we've been talking about a lot of negative stuff. And I just wanted to ask you, what's one emerging technology that excites you and that you think, or at least hope, will improve the lives of the people on this planet?
Oh, thank you. What a wonderful question. Well, I think I'll give you two. Well, let me just say that I do think that there is really interesting potential to use these generative and predictive large model systems to engage with them artistically, to use them to help you think about things from different angles, to use as a writing partner, say, in trying to develop ideas. So I actually think that there's a lot of excitement in these particular technologies. I just think that the way that they're being rolled out is irresponsible. Mm-hmm. And I also just wish that we change the way that we're relating to them, because we are in relation to them. Mm-hmm. And I'm just hoping that we're not so obsessed with whether or not they can fool us, and instead we try to create things with them.
That's a beautiful place to end. And thank you, Zac Zimmer, professor at UCSC, for joining me. And thanks to my previous guests as well. Listeners, please check ksqd.org for a podcast of this show with links to information we've discussed. Please subscribe to Talk of the Bay's stream on major podcasting platforms. Thanks for listening, and return again every weekday at 5 p.m. for more Talk of the Bay.